The whisper of her dress against the dusty boardwalk was the only sound Josephine Zimmer made as she stepped off the stagecoach into Sheridan, Wyoming Territory, in the autumn of 1877. Her eyes, the color of summer rain, took in the ramshackle buildings lining the main street while her fingers clutched a crumpled letter promising her a husband, a home, and perhaps someday, love. The journey from Philadelphia had been long, nearly unbearable at times. Josephine had spent most of it staring out the window, watching as civilization slowly gave way to the rugged, untamed landscape of the West. She hadn't spoken more than a dozen words since crossing the Mississippi, earning curious glances from her fellow travelers. But Josephine had learned long ago that silence was her sanctuary, her shield against a world that demanded too much and gave too little in return. Miss Zimmer, a tall man with a prominent mustache and expensive suit, approached her, consulting a small notebook. "I'm Harold Blackburn, representing Mr. Thomas Fleming. You're right on schedule." Josephine nodded, extending a gloved hand which the man shook briefly. "Not much of a talker, are you?" Blackburn chuckled, though his eyes narrowed slightly. "Well, no matter. Mr. Fleming is eager to meet his bride. He's one of Sheridan's most prominent citizens, owns the mercantile. You're a fortunate woman." Again, she nodded, retrieving her single valise from the stagecoach driver. "Follow me," Blackburn instructed. Turning on his heel without offering to carry her bag, Josephine followed, acutely aware of the stares from townsfolk as she passed. Women whispered behind their hands. Men tipped their hats with curious eyes. She kept her gaze fixed on Blackburn's back, counting her steps to steady her nerves. The mercantile was the largest building on the street, boasting a freshly painted sign and polished windows. Inside, a heavy-set man with thinning hair and a florid complexion stood behind the counter, directing a young clerk about a shipment. When the bell above the door announced their arrival, he looked up and smiled broadly. "Miss Zimmer, I presume." Thomas Fleming came around the counter, wiping his hands on his apron. He was perhaps 50 years old, with small eyes that disappeared entirely when he smiled. "Welcome to Sheridan, my dear. I trust your journey was pleasant." Josephine lowered her eyes and nodded. "She doesn't talk much," Blackburn interjected, handing Fleming the paperwork. "Quiet as a church mouse the whole way here, according to the stage driver." Fleming's smile faltered slightly. "Well, I'm sure you're just tired from your travels. Harold, thank you for escorting my bride. I can take things from here." After Blackburn departed, Fleming showed Josephine to a small room behind the store. "You'll stay here tonight," he explained, gesturing to a narrow bed. "Tomorrow we'll be married by Judge Wilson, and then you'll move into my home on Cedar Street. It's the finest house in Sheridan, 3 bedrooms and a proper kitchen. You'll want for nothing." Josephine smiled faintly and nodded once more, Fleming's brow furrowed. "Can you speak, Miss Zimmer?" "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Well then," he said, his voice tinged with relief. "I'll leave you to rest. We have much to discuss over dinner." Over a meal of roast beef and potatoes at the town's only restaurant, Fleming spoke at length about his business, his position on the town council, and his plans to expand the mercantile. Josephine listened attentively, occasionally nodding or offering the barest smile, but spoke only when directly questioned, and then with the fewest words possible. "You certainly don't waste words," Fleming remarked, a hint of irritation creeping into his voice. "The advertisement you responded to specifically mentioned I wanted a woman of pleasant conversation to brighten my evenings." "I'm sorry," Josephine murmured, staring at her plate. "No need to apologize, my dear. Perhaps you're simply overwhelmed. Things will improve once we're married and settled." But by the next morning, Fleming's patience had worn thin. When Josephine appeared for breakfast at the restaurant and again answered his questions with single words or silent nods, his expression darkened. "This won't do, Miss Zimmer," he said firmly. "I need a wife who can entertain my business associates, who can engage in conversation, not a silent statue." Tears welled in Josephine's eyes, but she remained silent. Fleming sighed heavily. "I've made a decision. I'm sorry, but I must rescind my offer of marriage. Harold will arrange your return passage to Philadelphia on tomorrow's stage." Josephine's hands trembled in her lap. "Please," she whispered, "I have nowhere to go. I'm sorry, truly I am, but I need a wife, not a ghost." Fleming placed money on the table. "This should cover your return journey and expenses until you find a suitable position back east." With that, he stood and walked out, leaving Josephine alone with her uneaten breakfast and shattered hopes. Word spread quickly through the small town. By midday, Josephine had become an object of curiosity and gossip as she sat on a bench outside the stage-coach office, wondering what would become of her. The ticket in her hand represented a future as bleak as the one she'd fled. "Excuse me, madam, is this seat taken?" Josephine looked up to see a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of pine needles. He wore the practical clothes of a working man: sturdy trousers, a faded shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat he now held respectfully in his hands. She shook her head, moving slightly to make room. The man sat, leaving a respectful distance between them. "Name's Patrick Harrington. I run a small ranch about 5 miles outside of town." Josephine nodded politely but said nothing. "I heard about your situation," Patrick continued, his voice gentle. "Folks in small towns talk." She looked away, shame coloring her cheeks. "Don't reckon it's much of anyone's business," Patrick said. "But I wanted to tell you something, Miss Zimmer. Some of us find silence more valuable than gold in these parts. Too many people filling the air with empty words." Josephine turned to study him, surprise evident in her expression. "I came to town for supplies," Patrick explained, "but I also need help at my ranch. I lost my housekeeper last month. She married a miner and moved to Montana. I could offer you employment if you've a mind to stay in Wyoming rather than return east." "Employment?" Josephine asked, her voice soft but clear. Patrick nodded. "Room, board, and fair wages to cook and keep house. It's not fancy living, but it's honest work. The ranch is quiet, peaceful. Just me and a couple of hands who bunk in the stable." Josephine hesitated, weighing her options. Return to Philadelphia, where her alcoholic father would likely have gambled away what little remained of her mother's inheritance, or stay in this wild territory with a stranger who claimed to value silence. "Why would you help me?" she asked. Patrick smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Let's just say I understand what it's like to be judged unfairly, and my mother taught me to offer assistance when it's within my power to do so." "I can cook," Josephine said softly, "and clean. That's all I'm asking for, Miss Zimmer. You're welcome to stay as long as you wish and free to leave whenever you choose. I'll pay your stage fare back east if you find the arrangement unsuitable." Josephine considered his offer, studying his open, honest face. There was kindness in his eyes and something else, a quietness, a stillness that matched her own. "I accept," she said simply. Relief washed over Patrick's features. "Good. We'll leave within the hour if that suits you. I've got supplies to gather, then we can be on our way before nightfall." As Patrick Harrington loaded his wagon with supplies from the mercantile, Josephine couldn't help but notice the cold stare Fleming directed at them both. The mercantile owner clearly took her acceptance of employment elsewhere as a personal affront. Yet there was little he could do, having rejected her himself. The journey to the Harrington Ranch took nearly 2 hours along a rutted trail that wound through rolling grasslands dotted with stands of pine and aspen. Josephine sat beside Patrick on the wagon seat, watching as antelope bounded away at their approach and hawks circled lazily overhead. "It's beautiful," she murmured, breaking a long but comfortable silence. Patrick glanced at her, pleased. "That it is. Most beautiful country God ever made, in my estimation. It gets in your blood." The ranch came into view as they crested a gentle rise, a sturdy log house with a wide porch, a large barn, corrals, and several outbuildings, all nestled in a protected valley with a creek running through it. Behind the buildings rose forested foothills leading to the distant Blue Mountains. "It's not much compared to what Fleming could offer," Patrick said, suddenly self-conscious, "but it's mine, free and clear." "It's lovely," Josephine said sincerely. As they pulled into the yard, two men emerged from the barn, one older with a silver-streaked beard, the other barely more than a boy. "That's Emmett Wilson, my foreman," Patrick explained, "and young Billy Taylor, our stable hand. Good men, both of them. They live in quarters behind the barn." Patrick helped Josephine down from the wagon, then turned to his employees. "Emmett, Billy, this is Miss Josephine Zimmer. She'll be taking over as housekeeper." Both men touched their hats respectfully. "Madam," they murmured in unison. "Don't worry about these two bothering you," Patrick assured her. "They take their meals in the bunkhouse except for Sunday dinner, which we all share." Josephine nodded, relieved she wouldn't be expected to converse with strangers regularly. The interior of the ranch house was simple but well built, with a large main room containing a stone fireplace, dining table, and several comfortable chairs. A kitchen occupied one end, while two doors led to what Patrick explained were bedrooms. "This one's yours," he said, opening the door to a small but pleasant room with a narrow bed, chest of drawers, and a window overlooking the creek. "The other's mine. The washroom's off the kitchen. It's not fancy, but there's running water from the creek." "It's more than adequate," Josephine assured him. "Thank you." "I'll let you get settled," Patrick said. "There's food in the pantry for supper. Tomorrow I can show you around properly." Left alone, Josephine sat on the bed, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. That morning, she'd expected to be a bride. By afternoon, she'd been rejected and nearly sent back east in disgrace. Now, as evening approached, she found herself in a strange house miles from town, employed by a man she barely knew. Yet as she unpacked her meager belongings, she felt an unexpected sense of relief. There were no expectations here of witty conversation or social graces. Patrick Harrington seemed to ask nothing of her but what she was comfortable giving. In the kitchen, she found a well-organized pantry and decided to prepare a simple meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread. As she worked, she hummed softly to herself, something she hadn't done in years. When Patrick returned from the barn, he paused in the doorway, watching as she moved efficiently around his kitchen. "Something smells mighty good," he said appreciatively. Josephine turned, a faint smile touching her lips. "Supper will be ready shortly." They ate at the kitchen table, another comfortable silence between them broken only occasionally by Patrick's practical questions about whether she had everything she needed. "I should warn you," he said as they finished. "Fleming won't take kindly to you staying here. He's not a man who accepts defeat gracefully." Josephine looked down at her plate. "He made his choice. That he did, and a foolish one at that." Patrick caught himself, clearing his throat awkwardly. "What I mean is, any man who values endless chatter over thoughtful silence is missing something important. Most people find me difficult," Josephine admitted quietly. "My father always said I was stubborn, refusing to speak when spoken to. Were you refusing or simply considering your words? Patrick asked. Josephine looked up, surprised by his perception. No one's ever asked me that before. Well, I'm asking now. She considered his question carefully. Words never come easily to me. When I'm expected to respond quickly, my mind freezes. The more someone demands I speak, the harder it becomes. Patrick nodded thoughtfully. Sounds reasonable to me. Not everyone's meant to chatter like a magpie. My pa was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened because they knew it mattered. Josephine felt a tightness in her chest ease slightly. For the first time in memory, someone seemed to understand rather than judge her silence. The days that followed fell into a pleasant rhythm. Josephine rose early, preparing breakfast before Patrick headed out to work the ranch. She spent her days cleaning, baking, and gradually putting her personal touch on a house that had clearly lacked a woman's presence for some time. In the evenings, she and Patrick would share a meal, sometimes talking quietly, sometimes simply enjoying the peaceful silence. On her third day at the ranch, Josephine was hanging laundry when she noticed a small garden plot behind the house, neglected and overgrown. It was my mother's, Patrick explained when she asked about it at supper. She passed 5 years ago. I haven't had the heart to tend it properly since. May I? Josephine asked softly. Patrick's eyes warmed. I'd like that very much. The garden became Josephine's project. Each day she spent a few hours clearing weeds, turning soil, and planning what she might plant come spring. The physical labor was satisfying, allowing her mind to quiet as her hands worked. One crisp October afternoon, as Josephine knelt in the garden pulling the last stubborn weeds, she became aware of someone watching her. Looking up, she saw Patrick leaning against the fence, a gentle expression on his face. You remind me of her sometimes, he said. My mother. She found peace in that garden. I'm sorry I never met her, Josephine replied, brushing dirt from her hands as she stood. She would have liked you. She was a quiet soul who spoke when she had something to say, not just to fill silence. Patrick straightened, gesturing toward the distant mountains. I thought you might like to see more of the ranch. I need to check the north pasture fence. Would you care to ride along? Josephine hesitated. I've never ridden a horse. Patrick's eyebrows rose in surprise. Never, she shook her head, embarrassed. Well, that's easily remedied. Every Wyoming woman should know how to ride. His smile was warm, without a trace of mockery. I've got a gentle mare that would suit you fine. An hour later, Josephine found herself cautiously mounted on a placid chestnut horse named Maple, while Patrick rode a larger bay stallion beside her. Under his patient instruction, she quickly gained confidence, and by the time they reached the north pasture, she was smiling more freely than she had in years. You're a natural, Patrick encouraged as they dismounted near a section of damaged fence. While he worked to repair the broken rails, Josephine wandered a short distance away, enchanted by a small grove of aspen trees, their golden leaves shimmering in the afternoon light. It's like they're whispering, she said when Patrick joined her, having completed his task. The old ones say the trees hold the voices of those who have passed, he replied. That's why they tremble even when there's no wind. Josephine gazed up at the dancing leaves. What a lovely thought. There's a place about a mile from here I'd like to show you, Patrick said. If you're not too saddle sore. Josephine shook her head. I'd like to see it. They rode along a narrow trail that wound through the aspens and up a gentle slope. At the crest of a small hill, Patrick stopped and dismounted, helping Josephine from her horse. Look, he said simply, gesturing toward the valley that spread below them. Josephine's breath caught. From this vantage point, she could see the entire ranch property, the house and barn looking like toys in the distance. the creek winding like a silver ribbon through the golden grass, cattle grazing in the lower pasture, and beyond it all, the majestic mountains rising against the azure sky. "This is my favorite place on the whole ranch," Patrick said quietly. "When things get difficult or decisions need making, I come here to think." Josephine stood silently beside him, absorbing the beauty of the landscape. After a while she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for sharing this with me." Patrick turned to look at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "You understand it," he said. "Some people would just see land or property values, but you see what I see." "The soul of it," Josephine agreed. For a moment, they stood close enough that Josephine could feel the warmth radiating from his body, sense the subtle shift in the air between them. Then Patrick cleared his throat and moved toward the horses. "We should head back before dark," he said. "The trail can be tricky in fading light." As October gave way to November, Josephine settled more deeply into life at the ranch. She no longer jumped at small noises or constantly worried she was disappointing her employer. Patrick was unfailingly kind, appreciative of her efforts, and respectful of her quiet nature. They fell into comfortable routines, sharing the evening meal and sometimes reading by the fire afterward. Patrick had a small but well-loved collection of books, which he generously offered for her enjoyment. Occasionally, he would read aloud, his deep voice bringing the words to life while Josephine mended or knitted beside him. Sunday dinners with Emmett and Billy became moments Josephine actually looked forward to rather than dreaded. The men were polite and undemanding, seeming to take their cues from Patrick about respecting her reserved nature. One Sunday in mid-November, as snow fell gently outside, Billy mentioned news from town. "Mr. Fleming's been asking about Miss Zimmer," he said between bites of the venison roast Josephine had prepared. "Wanted to know if she was still out here." Patrick's expression darkened. "What did you tell him?" Billy shrugged. "Just said she was working as housekeeper like you told us." He didn't seem happy about it. "Man's got no claim on her," Emmett interjected, his weathered face serious. "Made his choice plain as day when he sent her packing." Josephine kept her eyes on her plate, discomfort rising within her. The thought of Thomas Fleming still concerning himself with her whereabouts was unsettling. "Don't worry about Fleming," Patrick told her later after the men had returned to their quarters. "He's just wounded pride, nothing more." Josephine nodded but remained troubled. "I don't want to cause problems for you." Patrick's expression softened. "You've caused nothing but improvement around here, Josephine. The house hasn't been this clean or well managed since my mother was alive, and I haven't eaten this well in years." His praise warmed her, but worry still lingered. "If Mr. Fleming is influential in town, Fleming has influence with certain types," Patrick acknowledged, "but I've never much cared for town politics. My business is here on this land." His confidence was reassuring, but as Josephine prepared for bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas Fleming might not be so easily dismissed. Her fears proved prescient the very next day, when the sound of an approaching wagon interrupted her bread-making. Wiping flour from her hands, she went to the window and felt her stomach clench at the sight of Thomas Fleming himself, accompanied by the ever-present Harold Blackburn, pulling up to the ranch house. Patrick emerged from the barn, his stance wary as he approached the visitors. Josephine couldn't hear their conversation, but the tension in Patrick's shoulders was visible even from a distance. After several minutes of what appeared to be increasingly heated exchange, Fleming and Blackburn departed, Patrick watching them go with a grim expression. "What did they want?" Josephine asked when he entered the kitchen, his jaw tight with anger. Patrick poured himself a cup of coffee before answering. "Fleming claims you owe him money for your passage west since you didn't fulfill the marriage agreement." That's ridiculous, Josephine protested. He's the one who changed his mind. I know that, and you know that, Patrick agreed, but Fleming's spinning it differently. Says you misrepresented yourself in your letters, claiming to be charming and conversational. Josephine sank into a chair, her face pale. I never claimed any such thing. My letters were straightforward about my background and abilities as a housekeeper. I never mentioned my manner of speaking. I believe you, Patrick assured her. But Fleming's threatening to involve the law if you don't either pay him back or return to Philadelphia on the next stage. I don't have that kind of money, Josephine whispered, anguish in her voice. Everything I had went into coming west. Patrick sat across from her, his green eyes intense. You don't need to worry about money. I told Fleming in no uncertain terms that you're under my protection now, and if he wants to pursue this matter, he'll have to deal with me. Warmth bloomed in Josephine's chest at his declaration. Thank you, she said softly, but I can't allow you to pay my debts. There is no debt, Patrick insisted. Fleming is trying to save face. He made a poor decision and now regrets it, especially seeing how well you've settled here. A worrying thought occurred to Josephine. What if his true purpose is to force me to leave your employment? Perhaps he wants me gone from Sheridan altogether. Patrick considered this, his brow furrowing. It's possible. Fleming doesn't like losing, and in his mind you chose me over him. I didn't choose, Josephine began, then stopped abruptly, realizing how the situation might appear to outsiders. A rejected mail-order bride immediately taking up residence with another man, miles from town and proper supervision. Oh, she breathed, understanding dawning. People will think. They'll assume that there's more between us than an employment arrangement, Patrick finished for her, his expression grave. Yes, I expect that's exactly what Fleming is implying. Josephine stood, pacing the small kitchen in distress. I should leave. I can't allow your reputation to suffer because of me. Sit down, Josephine, Patrick said firmly. Running won't solve anything, and I care far less about gossip than I do about your well-being. She hesitated, then slowly resumed her seat. What do you suggest? Patrick took a deep breath. There are two paths forward as I see it. We can fight Fleming's claims, which might involve a legal battle and public scrutiny of your situation. Or, she prompted when he fell silent. Or we could remove the basis of his complaint entirely, Patrick said carefully. If you were my wife rather than my employee, Fleming would have no grounds to demand repayment for a broken marriage contract. Josephine stared at him, her heart suddenly racing. Are you proposing marriage, Mr. Harrington? A faint flush colored Patrick's tan cheeks. I'm proposing a practical solution to a difficult problem. We get along well enough, and the arrangement we have is working for both of us. Marriage would simply formalize it and protect you from Fleming's machinations. A marriage of convenience, Josephine clarified, trying to ignore the strange disappointment that swept through her. At first, perhaps, Patrick admitted. But who's to say what might develop with time? We've only known each other a month, but I respect you greatly, Josephine. I value your presence in my home and your quiet strength. Josephine looked down at her flour-dusted hands. You would tie yourself to a woman most fine, peculiar, even defective, to spare her from a man like Fleming. Patrick reached across the table, gently lifting her chin until their eyes met. There is nothing defective about you, Josephine Zimmer. Your quietness is a gift in a world that never stops talking. I've grown to treasure our silent moments as much as our conversations. Tears welled in Josephine's eyes at his words. No one had ever spoken to her that way, seen her silence as something precious rather than problematic. Think on it, Patrick said, releasing her and standing. There's no rush to decide. Fleming can bluster all he wants, but he can't force you to leave as long as you're under my roof. For the remainder of the day, Josephine moved through her tasks in a daze, her mind circling Patrick's unexpected proposal. Marriage had been her original purpose in coming west, but she'd imagined it very differently, a business arrangement with a stranger who wanted a practical wife and might, over time, develop some affection for her. What Patrick offered seemed both more and less than that. Less because he framed it initially as a solution to a problem, a way to thwart Fleming's schemes, but more because in just 1 month, he had shown her more understanding and respect than any man in her life ever had. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Josephine finally broke the silence that had stretched between them all day. "If I were to accept your proposal," she said carefully, "what would you expect of me as your wife?" Patrick set aside the book he'd been pretending to read. "Nothing more than what you already give freely: your company, your care of this home. I would never demand more than you're comfortable with, Josephine." She nodded slowly, studying the flames dancing in the fireplace. "And would we share a bedroom?" The directness of her question clearly surprised him, but he answered honestly, "That would be your choice. I won't pretend I don't find you attractive, but I would never pressure you. The second bedroom could remain yours for as long as you wished it." His candor both reassured and intrigued her. "I've never," she began, then faltered. "I understand," Patrick said gently, "and I would never rush you, Josephine. Marriage is a partnership that grows with time and trust." Josephine took a deep breath, her decision crystallizing. "Then I accept your proposal, Patrick Harrington." Surprise and something warmer flashed in his eyes. "Are you certain? I don't want you to feel forced by circumstances." "I'm choosing this," she assured him. "Perhaps not for the reasons I imagined when I came west, but I'm choosing nonetheless." A slow smile spread across Patrick's face, transforming his features. "Then I'm honored to be your choice, Josephine Zimmer." They were married the following Sunday by a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through the area. The ceremony was simple, held in the ranch house parlor with only Emmett and Billy as witnesses. Josephine wore her best dress, a modest blue gown that matched her eyes, while Patrick donned a clean shirt and his least worn trousers. The preacher seemed mildly surprised by the couple's reserved demeanor, but proceeded without comment. When it came time for their vows, Josephine's voice was soft but clear, her gaze steady as she promised to honor and cherish Patrick. For his part, Patrick spoke with quiet conviction, his eyes never leaving hers as he pledged his life and loyalty. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher announced when the vows were completed. Patrick hesitated, his eyes questioning. Josephine gave a slight nod, and he leaned forward, brushing his lips against hers in a kiss that was brief but tender, sending an unexpected warmth through her body. Afterward, they shared a celebratory meal that Josephine had prepared, with Emmett producing a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. The men toasted the newlyweds, and even Josephine accepted a small glass, the liquor burning pleasantly as she sipped it. As evening fell and their guests departed, an awkward silence descended. Josephine busied herself clearing the table while Patrick banked the fire, both acutely aware of the night ahead. "I meant what I said," Patrick told her as they stood in the hallway between their bedrooms. "The choice is yours, Josephine. I'll not expect anything you're not ready to give." Josephine studied his face in the soft lamplight, noting the gentle strength in his features, the patience in his eyes. Over the weeks she'd known him, Patrick Harrington had proven himself to be a man of his word, honorable and kind. "I would like to try," she said softly, "being a true wife to you." Patrick's expression softened. "We have all the time in the world, Josephine, there's no hurry." But when they came together that night, there was no awkwardness, no hesitation. In the quiet darkness of what was now their bedroom, Josephine discovered that the same patience Patrick showed in everyday life extended to this most intimate of acts. His touch was gentle, his words soft and encouraging as he guided her through unfamiliar territory. For Josephine, who had spent her life feeling out of step with the world, the experience was revelatory. Her body, which had always seemed a vessel for disappointment and inadequacy, became a source of pleasure and connection. And when they lay tangled together afterward, Patrick's heartbeat strong against her ear, she felt a profound sense of rightness, of belonging. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. Patrick's arms tightened around her. "For what?" "For seeing me," she replied simply. "The real me, not the broken version others perceive." "You were never broken, Josephine," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Just waiting for someone who understood your language of silence." Winter descended on Wyoming Territory with fierce determination. Heavy snowfalls isolated the ranch for days at a time, but inside the sturdy log house, Josephine and Patrick created a warm sanctuary. Their days fell into comfortable patterns. Patrick, tending to the livestock and necessary outside chores. Josephine, managing the household and experimenting with recipes from her mother's handwritten cookbook she'd brought from Philadelphia. In the evenings, they would read together by the fire, sometimes talking quietly about their pasts, their hopes, their dreams. Patrick spoke of his childhood in Missouri, his father's decision to head west after the Civil War, and the years of hard work that had transformed a raw piece of land into a thriving ranch. Josephine, in turn, shared stories of her mother's gentle influence and her father's descent into gambling and alcohol after her death. "Is that when you began to speak less?" Patrick asked one night as they lay in bed, the wind howling outside their window. Josephine considered the question, tracing patterns on his chest with her fingertips. "I was always quiet, even as a child. But yes, it grew worse after Mother died. Father would rage when he was drinking, demanding responses, explanations. The more he shouted for me to speak, the less I could form words." Patrick's arm tightened around her. "He should have protected you, not terrorized you." "He was lost in his own grief," Josephine said softly. But when he began speaking of arranging a marriage to one of his gambling associates, a man 3 times my age, I knew I had to leave. That's when I answered Mr. Fleming's advertisement." "I'm grateful you did," Patrick murmured, "though I'm sorry for the pain that brought you here." Josephine raised herself on one elbow to look at him in the dim light. "Are you truly not disappointed, with a wife who struggles to speak when emotions run high?" Patrick reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Josephine, in my 32 years, I've known many who talk endlessly but say nothing of value. Your words may be few, but they're thoughtful and true. That's worth more than all the empty chatter in the world." As winter deepened, their bond strengthened. Josephine found herself speaking more freely with Patrick than she ever had with anyone, while he seemed to develop an intuitive understanding of her moods, knowing when she needed silence and when gentle conversation would be welcome. By Christmas, Josephine realized with quiet amazement that she had fallen deeply in love with her husband. What had begun as a marriage of convenience had transformed into something profound and precious. Yet she hesitated to voice these feelings, uncertain if Patrick felt the same or merely a fond affection for the woman who shared his home and bed. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly outside, Patrick presented her with a small wrapped package. "It's not much," he said almost shyly, "but I wanted you to have something special for our first Christmas." Inside was a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. When Josephine opened it, she found a tiny sprig of aspen leaves pressed behind glass. From our first ride together, Patrick explained. When you said the trees were whispering. Tears welled in Josephine's eyes as she clutched the locket. It's beautiful, she whispered. I love it. Patrick helped her fasten it around her neck, his fingers lingering against her skin. I have something else for you, though it's not a physical gift. Josephine looked up questioningly. I received a letter from the bank in Sheridan yesterday, he continued. Fleming has officially withdrawn his claim against you. It seems our marriage removed his leverage as we hoped. Relief washed over Josephine. That's wonderful news. There's more, Patrick said, taking her hands in his. The letter also confirmed that I've been approved for a loan to expand the ranch. We can buy the adjacent Peterson property in spring, which means more grazing land and access to the larger creek. Patrick, that's wonderful, Josephine exclaimed, genuinely happy for him. You've worked so hard for this. We've worked hard, he corrected her. This ranch has flourished with your presence, Josephine. And not just the house, the entire operation runs more smoothly because I'm happier, more focused. Josephine felt a blush warm her cheeks. I've done very little. You've done everything, Patrick interrupted gently. You've created a home where before there was just a house. You've brought peace and purpose back into my life when I didn't even realize they were missing. He took a deep breath, his green eyes intense in the firelight. What I'm trying to say, rather poorly, is that I love you, Josephine Harrington. Not for convenience or practicality, but with all my heart. I think I began falling in love with you that first day on the bench in Sheridan, and every quiet moment since has only deepened those feelings. Josephine felt as though her heart might burst from joy. I love you too, she whispered, the words coming easily for once. So very much. Patrick gathered her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion words couldn't express. When they finally parted, breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. I have one more thing to tell you, he said softly. The expansion means we'll need to hire more hands come spring. I was thinking we might need a larger house as well, especially if our family grows. Josephine's eyes widened as his meaning became clear. Are you saying you want children? Patrick smiled, a hint of vulnerability in his expression. Very much so if you do. I've always wanted a family but never found the right woman to build one with. Until now. I want that too, Josephine admitted, her voice thick with emotion. A family with you. Their Christmas celebration the next day was simple but joyful. Emmett and Billy joined them for dinner, marveling at the transformation of their usually stoic boss into a man who couldn't keep his eyes off his wife. Josephine, for her part, found herself speaking more than usual, her happiness loosening the constraints that typically bound her tongue. In January, a week of relatively mild weather allowed Patrick to make a trip into Sheridan for supplies and mail. He returned with news that the town was buzzing with gossip about Thomas Fleming's engagement to a widow from Cheyenne, a woman reportedly known for her vivacious personality and social connections. Seems Fleming found someone more to his liking, Patrick remarked as they sat at supper. The wedding is set for spring. I hope she brings him happiness, Josephine said sincerely. Patrick raised an eyebrow. That's generous of you, considering how he treated you. Josephine shrugged slightly. He did me a great favor, though he didn't realize it at the time. If he hadn't rejected me, I would never have found my way to you. Patrick reached across the table to take her hand. Then I'm grateful for his foolishness, though not for the pain it caused you. As winter gradually released its grip on the land, signs of new beginnings emerged. The Peterson property was officially purchased, expanding the Harrington Ranch by nearly 500 acres. Patrick hired 2 additional hands to help with the increased workload, men he carefully selected not just for their ranching skills, but for their respectful, quiet demeanors. And in late February, As the first crocuses pushed through the melting snow around the house, Josephine confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks: she was expecting their first child. She told Patrick one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of pink and gold. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for: joy, wonder, and tender concern all mingled in his expression as he knelt before her, pressing his ear to her still flat stomach as though he might hear the tiny life growing within. "A baby," he murmured in awe. "Our baby." "Due in September, I think," Josephine said softly, running her fingers through his hair. Patrick looked up at her, his eyes shining. "Are you happy, truly? Happier than I ever imagined possible," she assured him. "Are you?" "Beyond words," he replied, which made them both laugh at the irony. As spring fully arrived, Josephine's condition became a source of shared joy and planning. Patrick insisted on building a cradle himself, laboring over it in the evenings while Josephine sewed tiny garments and prepared a corner of their bedroom for the new arrival. The garden behind the house burst into life under Josephine's care, now expanded to include vegetables for their growing family. On warm afternoons, she would sit among the plants, reading aloud from one of Patrick's books, believing that even in the womb their child should hear the sound of her voice, however quiet it might be. In May, they made their first trip together into Sheridan since their marriage. Josephine was nervous about facing the townspeople, particularly Thomas Fleming, but Patrick assured her they would manage any awkwardness together. "Besides," he said as he helped her into the wagon, "you have nothing to be ashamed of. You're a respected rancher's wife now, carrying his child." "Hold your head high, Josephine." The town had grown even in the months she'd been away, with several new buildings under construction and more people on the boardwalks. As they pulled up in front of the general store no longer owned by Fleming, who had sold it to focus on other business interests, Josephine felt curious eyes upon them. Patrick helped her down from the wagon, his hand protectively at the small of her back where her condition was just becoming visible beneath her loose dress. "Ready?" he asked softly. Josephine nodded, squaring her shoulders. Inside the store, the new proprietor greeted them warmly, having done business with Patrick for years. As they gathered their supplies, several townsfolk approached to introduce themselves to Mrs. Harrington, their curiosity evident but their manners generally polite. Josephine answered their questions with brief, courteous responses, drawing strength from Patrick's steady presence beside her. She noticed with relief that her silence seemed less remarkable here, where many of the settlers came from taciturn stock, valuing actions over words. As they were loading their purchases into the wagon, a familiar figure emerged from the bank across the street. Thomas Fleming, dressed in an expensive suit, stopped short when he spotted them, his expression unreadable. After a moment's hesitation, he crossed to where they stood. "Mr. Harrington, Mrs. Harrington," he said stiffly, tipping his hat. "I trust you're well." "Very well, thank you," Patrick replied evenly. "And congratulations on your upcoming nuptials. We hear your bride arrives from Cheyenne next week." Fleming's eyes flickered to Josephine, noting her condition with a brief widening of surprise. "Yes, thank you. Miss Thornton is eager to make Sheridan her home." He paused awkwardly, then added, "It seems we've both found suitable partners after all." "Indeed we have," Josephine said softly, meeting his gaze directly. Something like regret passed across Fleming's features before he nodded briskly. "Good day to you both," he said, and continued on his way. "You handled that beautifully," Patrick murmured as he helped Josephine back into the wagon. "It was easier than I expected," she admitted. "He seems diminished somehow," Patrick chuckled as he climbed up beside her. "That's because you've grown stronger, Josephine." The woman who stepped off that stagecoach last fall would never have looked Thomas Fleming in the eye and spoken so calmly. She considered this as they drove home, realizing the truth in his words. She was still quiet by nature, still found large gatherings and excessive conversation draining, but the paralyzing anxiety that had once accompanied social interactions had eased considerably. "You've changed me," she told Patrick that evening as they sat on their porch, watching the first stars appear. "No," he disagreed gently. "I've simply given you space to be yourself without judgment. The strength was always there, Josephine. You just needed someone who valued your silence as much as your words." As summer progressed, the ranch flourished under their combined care. The new land allowed for increased cattle production, and Patrick's reputation for fair dealing and quality stock spread throughout the territory. Josephine's garden yielded abundantly, providing fresh produce for their table and enough to preserve for the winter ahead. With her advancing pregnancy, Josephine found herself slowing down, taking more time to rest during the day. Patrick insisted on hiring a young woman from town, Mary Callahan, to help with the heavier household chores 3 days a week. Initially resistant to having a stranger in her domain, Josephine soon came to appreciate Mary's cheerful efficiency and respectful manner. "She thinks you walk on water," Patrick told her one night, amused. "Says you've created the most peaceful household she's ever worked in." Josephine smiled, running a hand over her rounded belly. High praise from a girl who's worked in half the homes in Sheridan. "Deserved praise," Patrick insisted. "You've created something special here, Josephine. Not just a house or even a home, but a haven." August brought sweltering heat that made Josephine uncomfortable and restless. The baby was active now, particularly at night, making sleep difficult. Often, she would slip out of bed and sit on the porch, the slight breeze offering some relief as she watched the moon travel across the star-filled sky. Patrick frequently joined her during these nocturnal vigils, his presence comforting as they sat side by side in companionable silence. Sometimes they would talk softly about their hopes for their child, the qualities they wished to nurture, the values they hoped to instill. "What if our child inherits my quietness?" Josephine asked one such night, giving voice to a fear that had been growing within her. Patrick considered this thoughtfully. "Then we'll love and support them exactly as they are, helping them find their own way of moving through the world, and we'll make sure they never feel lacking because they experience things differently than others." His answer, so simple yet profound, brought tears to Josephine's eyes. "You'll be a wonderful father," she whispered. "And you, my love, will be an extraordinary mother," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Our child is fortunate indeed to have you, a woman whose strength lies not in how much she says, but in how deeply she feels and how completely she loves." Their son was born on a clear September morning as the first golden leaves began to fall from the aspens. The labor was long but uncomplicated, with Mary Callahan and the midwife from town attending while Patrick paced anxiously outside the bedroom door. When finally allowed inside, Patrick approached the bed with reverent steps, his eyes fixed on the small bundle cradled in Josephine's arms. "We have a son," she said softly, her face glowing despite her exhaustion. Patrick sat carefully beside them, one finger gently tracing the perfect curve of his son's cheek. "He's beautiful," he whispered, "just like his mother." The baby yawned and opened his eyes green like his father's, regarding them solemnly. "What shall we call him?" Patrick asked. Josephine smiled. "I was thinking of Samuel after your father, Samuel Patrick Harrington." "It's perfect," Patrick agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Hello, Samuel," he said to his son. "You are so very loved. In the weeks that followed, their lives adjusted to accommodate this new precious being. Samuel proved to be a content baby, fussing only when hungry or uncomfortable, otherwise regarding his surroundings with the same quiet intensity his mother often displayed. "He has your temperament," Patrick observed one evening as they watched their son sleeping in his cradle. Observant, taking everything in before deciding how to respond. "Is that a good thing?" Josephine asked, still occasionally plagued by doubt despite her happiness. Patrick drew her into his arms. "It's a wonderful thing," he assured her. "The world has enough people rushing to judgment, speaking without thought. Our son will grow to be a man who listens first and speaks with purpose." As winter approached once more, Josephine reflected on the extraordinary changes a single year had brought. From rejected mail-order bride to beloved wife and mother, from uncertain stranger to confident mistress of a prosperous ranch. The path had been unexpected, but she wouldn't change a single step. One December evening, with Samuel sleeping peacefully and snow falling gently outside, Patrick found Josephine standing by the window, absently fingering the aspen leaf locket she still wore daily. "What are you thinking about so intently?" he asked, slipping his arms around her waist. She leaned back against his solid warmth. "How grateful I am that Thomas Fleming found me too quiet," Patrick chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her back. "His loss my immeasurable gain. Do you ever wish I were more talkative?" Josephine asked, turning in his arms to search his face. Patrick shook his head, his expression serious. "Never. Your silence has always been golden to me, Josephine. It's where your strength lives, where your wisdom grows. In a world of constant noise, you've shown me the power and beauty of stillness." Josephine reached up to trace the beloved contours of his face. "I love you, Patrick Harrington, with every quiet corner of my heart." "And I love you," he replied, lowering his lips to hers. Words cannot express how much. As they kissed, Samuel stirred and let out a small cry. They parted, smiling at each other in perfect understanding before moving together to tend to their son. In the years that followed, the Harrington Ranch prospered and expanded, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. Samuel grew into a thoughtful, capable boy who shared his father's love for the land and his mother's contemplative nature. He was joined by a sister, Emma, whose arrival 2 years later brought new joy to their family, and later by twin brothers, James and William, completing their family circle. Josephine continued to speak sparingly but meaningfully, her quiet confidence earning respect throughout the county. She became known not for how much she said, but for how carefully people listened when she chose to speak. The garden behind the ranch house expanded into a showpiece that travelers came miles to admire, and her preserved fruits and vegetables won blue ribbons at the territorial fair. Patrick's prediction proved accurate. The home Josephine created became a haven not just for their family, but for others seeking peace. Young ranch hands found guidance and stability under Patrick's mentorship, while troubled young women occasionally found temporary shelter with Josephine until they could establish themselves safely elsewhere. Thomas Fleming and his Cheyenne bride established themselves as prominent figures in Sheridan society, hosting elaborate parties and involving themselves in every civic committee. Occasionally, Josephine would encounter Mrs. Fleming in town, their exchanges polite but distant. The woman's constant stream of conversation always left Josephine feeling grateful for her own quieter existence. One summer evening, as Josephine and Patrick sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place of profound contentment. "You ever think about how differently our lives might have turned out?" she asked her husband. "If Fleming had married me as planned, Patrick considered the question, his hand warm around hers. "I try not to dwell on might-have-beens," he replied, "but I do thank Providence daily for bringing you to that bench outside the stagecoach office." Josephine smiled, remembering that pivotal moment. "You said something that day that changed everything for me. You told me silence was golden." "And so it has proven to be," Patrick said softly. "The quiet moments between us have always held the deepest meaning." As twilight deepened around them and their children's laughter filled the air, Josephine leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, no words necessary between them. In the peaceful silence they shared, everything that mattered most was spoken in the language of love. They had created together a language that required few words but infinite understanding. And in that silence, golden as the aspen leaves in autumn, their hearts continued their conversation, more eloquent than any words could ever be.